Zoom, but
yeah, Zoom is a lot easier.
all right. Looks like we are live. This
Okay.
thing is giving me that indication. So we can go ahead and start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kena Townsend. I am the Director of Education and Outreach at the Robert Russell Moton Museum located in Farmville, Virginia. And today for this edition of Moton Mondays, we are joined by Dr. Amy Tillerson-Brown. And I will give some brief introductions about her and then give the floor over to her to give her presentation. The topic of today's Moton Mondays talk is Black women in Prince Edward County, abolitionists and activists from 1959 to 1963. Now, Dr. Tillerson-Brown is a professor of history at the History Department and the History Department chair at Mary Baldwin University in Stanton, Virginia. And she teaches courses in African American, U.S., women and African diaspora history. She also directs the African American Studies program and the public history programs while advising Phi Alpha Theta, the National History Honor Society. Dr. Tillerson-Brown is completing her book manuscript, Negotiating Intersections of Gender, Social Class, and Race, Black Women in Prince Edward County, Virginia, Activists and Community Builders from 1920 to 1965. This project analyzes the activism of Black women in Prince Edward County before and during the public school crisis that began with the 1951 Robert Russell Moton student walkout in protest of inadequate educational facilities that ended with the reopening of the public schools that closed from 1959 to 1964 to resist desegregation and the mandate of the Brown decision. So a little bit before accepting her position at Mary Baldwin, she was the director of the African American Heritage Program at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities at UVA. She's taught in the history departments of Virginia Tech, Morgan State University, and Piedmont Virginia Community College, and has also worked as a public school teacher and counselor at Roanoke City Public Schools and Baltimore City Public Schools. So without further ado, I will now give the floor over to Dr. Tillerson-Brown to give her presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation. And thanks to all of you who are watching. I think I'm going to start talking about a now federal holiday, Juneteenth. Juneteenth gives us all reason to celebrate, but also to agitate. Similar to the way notification of emancipation was not eagerly disseminated, today's road to racial equity remains shrouded and winding. Despite the tenacity of struggle, enslaved Black people had always been active agents in freeing themselves and did not simply wait for their freedom to be granted. On June 19, 1865, 2.5 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 5 months after the 13th Amendment that prohibited involuntary servitude, 2 months after Lee surrendered to Grant, and 17 days after the last surrender of Confederate troops to Union Army, enslaved Blacks in Galveston, Texas, received word that they were no longer legally enslaved. Notable here, though, is the fact that Lincoln was president of the United States of America and Texas joined the Confederate States of America, March 1861. So his Emancipation Proclamation had little effect on the legal status of Blacks enslaved in the South. On the world stage, however, the Emancipation Proclamation established the centrality of slavery to the cause of the Civil War. It also encouraged more Blacks to flee to Union lines to free themselves, something they had been doing since the beginning of the Civil War. Despite the passage of the 13th Amendment, the Civil War, now clearly being fought to determine the question of slavery, waged on. Even after Lee's surrender on Palm Sunday, Confederate troops in Texas and beyond continued to fight. It wasn't until June 2nd, 65, that Confederate General Edmund Smith surrendered to Union forces in Galveston. So here we are, June 19th, the eve of summer, and Major General Gordon Granger, along with nearly 2,000 Union soldiers, descended on Galveston, reading General Order Number 3, that declared all slaves are free, while encouraging them to stay quiet and work for wages on their present plantations. They had Black people at free, though. After generations of enslavement, the racial trauma they endured, simple freedom was a victory. To commemorate this monumental declaration of freedom, Galveston, Texas, June 19, 1865, generation of Blacks have been jubilant in their celebrations. Known as Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, and Jubilee Day, Black people have celebrated emancipation since 1865. The fact that these same jubilant Blacks who dared to act on Union General Gordon Granger's order could be hunted with no reprisal helped to explain our contemporary racial justice challenges and obligation to continue the trek for justice. Alice Gillum Scott, a Black woman born enslaved in Prince Edward County, may not have celebrated Juneteenth by name. It is likely that her celebration was called Emancipation Day celebration. It was by 1898 that editor of the Richmond Planet, John Mitchell, started reporting on grand Emancipation Day events in this Commonwealth to commemorate the end of slavery. Alice Scott, though a child when enslaved, appears to have been born with an activist streak. Her granddaughter, Flossie Hudson, remembered the story of when Alice Scott received her most memorable whipping from her master. She was told to go to the spring to draw fresh water, but because of the severe snowstorm at the time, she refused. She must have known that the consequence of her refusal could have been a whipping, but she was willing to take her chances. Her family's oral tradition had it that Alice was beaten by her master as a result of her resistance. Sometimes it proves important to stand for justice, even when you know you won't likely receive it. The tradition of activism continued with Hudson as she resisted objectives of the Prince Edward County Christian Association to operate a grassroots school in the basement of her Prospect, Virginia home. Similar to how Blacks enslaved in the United States did not wait for freedom to be granted, Flossie Scott White Hudson did not wait for Prince Edward County's segregationist board of supervisors to appropriate funding to operate public schools, or the courts to force them open. With no public or private schools available to Black Prince Edwardians during Virginia's massive resistance, families used whatever means they could to educate their children. Locally, Black women opened what I call grassroots schools in their homes for their own children and or other Black children in their several communities. In January 1960, the National Council of Negro Women, under the leadership of Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, hosted a Crisis in Prince Edward County meeting in which Jean Fairfax, a member of the American Friends Service Committee, participated. AFSC is a national organization that was formed in 1917 to provide alternatives to military service for Quakers and other conscientious objectors. The American Friends later expanded its focus to include fighting for peace and social justice. They believed that the crisis in Prince Edward deserved attention. So the American Friends representatives established a headquarters in Farmville, and in less than 3 months over the summer developed the Emergency Student Placement Project. Working in collaboration with the Prince Edward County Christian Association, the local organization of which Reverend L. Francis Griffin was president and the intrepid leader, it was formed to provide recreational activities for Black students locked out of schools. The ESPP connected Black Prince Edward County students locked out of schools with a host of families across the country so that they could receive an education. For students who were unable or unwilling to relocate, the PECCA developed play study groups that provided students with recreational activities while the county had no schools. Not to be confused with private schools, Reverend Griffin described the play study groups as strictly, quote, a morale booster, end quote. By July 1960, the play study groups evolved into training centers that also promoted recreation, but according to Jean Fairfax, expected that some academic training would be facilitated as well. Training centers were replaced by summer crash courses, first taught by members of the Virginia Teachers Association and then by white college students from the North. The general consensus was that the summer sessions were a good effort, but not sufficient to prepare students for their return to school. PECCA and the American Friends organizational records sometimes refer to the Prince Edward County grassroots schools as centers. However, the students and teachers referred to them as schools. Additionally, grassroots schools existed even after 1962 when the training centers were no longer operational. Nonetheless, the primary objective of these grassroots schools was to provide academic training. Flossie Hudson was one grassroots school teacher. Born February 2nd, 1924, Flossie Hudson was a graduate of Moton High and a hairdresser by trade. She grew up in a family with a history of resistance and activism. Her parents, Otis E. Scott and Susan Lindsay Scott, were from Prospect, where they attended Sulphur Spring Baptist Church. Otis Scott owned more than 100 acres of land in the Prospect District, and Susan Scott was a housewife. Otis Scott was actively involved in the NAACP as one of the county's charter members and one of the few life members in the county. He worked diligently with the Prince Edward County PTA alongside Reverend Vernon Johns and John Lancaster and others to pressure the school board to purchase land for a new high school in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Otis Scott's mother was Alice Scott, the enslaved child who dared refuse to follow her master's directive. Alice Scott was also a Prospect midwife. Otis's father and Alice Scott's husband, Henry Lewis Scott, was born enslaved and after emancipation became a farmer. Flossie Hudson was born into this tradition of activism. Nearly 50 school-age children from both the Calvary and Sulphur Spring communities, ranging in age from 6 to 16, gathered in the basement of Hudson's home for school from 1959 to 1963. 5 days a week from September through June, and for 4 years, Hudson kept a roll. Hudson creatively acquired old school bus seats and discarded desks, and she used her personal furniture to accommodate her students from 59 to 63 when the free schools opened in the county. When asked how she managed nearly 50 students per day, Hudson admitted that sometimes some of the older students would help with the younger ones, teaching them to read and whatnot. Hudson remembered that her paternal aunt and former Prince Edward County elementary school teacher, Pearl C. Allen, occasionally assisted at the school until an official center was established at Five Forks School, a former Black elementary school, where Allen began to teach. Hudson was former secretary of the local NAACP branch, and her father, Otis Scott, and Griffin worked together regularly in civic and church organizations. When the Prince Edward County Christian Association sponsored training centers emerged, Hudson's grassroots school had been in operation for months. While Hudson provided recreational activities for her students, she also taught reading, writing, and math. Hudson didn't mask the fact that her students were receiving academic training. Sarah Vaughn Jordan was 9 years old and in the 3rd grade when public schools closed. She attended Hudson School and remembered receiving academic training. She said, I quote, "We learned in Mrs. Hudson's school. We had lessons in the morning, and when the weather was nice, we would have recess. It was like real school," end quote. Math and reading lessons were included in the daily activities, as they were in many other grassroots schools' curriculums throughout the county. In September 1959, the same month Hudson started her school, Beatrice Lawson Davenport and Elizabeth Colfax Hill Watson, both former public school teachers, organized a grassroots school in the basement of St. James AME Church. Watkins was born in 1908 on Israel Hill, a free Black community in Prince Edward. James William D. Bland, who was elected on the Republican ticket to the Senate of Virginia, 1869, was a maternal relative of hers. Watkins grew up as a member of the First Baptist Church in Farmville, but after she married James Monroe Watkins of Prospect in 1954, at the age of 50, she began to attend St. James AME Church. Watkins left Prince Edward County in 1961 to accept a teaching position in Bedford County, Virginia, and returned to Prince Edward County to teach when public schools reopened. The St. James School, like Mrs. Hudson's basement school, operated as a grassroots school and opened before training centers were organized in the county. Additionally, grassroots schools operated with the primary objective of academically educating the students who attended. Beatrice Davenport was born in Roanoke on September 15, 1901, to James and Amelia Lawson. In the 1920s, she moved to Prince Edward County to teach at the First Rock Elementary School, and she attended First Rock Baptist Church. Before she met and married loving Samuel Davenport of Prince Edward County, Lawson boarded with Lee and Carrie Hill, the parents of Libby Hill Jordan. The Hills' home was within walking distance of both the First Rock School and church. Davenport was Libby Hill's elementary school teacher and mentored her throughout her career. They worked together in the church's missionary circle, Sunday school, and various other church programs. Davenport was a member of the Martha E. Forrester Council of Women, which began as the Colored Council of Women, a community service organization influential in raising money necessary to establish the first Black high school in the county. She taught for 44 years in Prince Edward County public school system, spending most of her years of service at the First Rock School in Prospect. Davenport did not have any biological children, but she cared for a stepson and 4 nieces. She died March 21, 1989, of congestive heart failure. Now, Libby Hill Jordan was born March 1912 in Prospect. As I said, her parents were Lee and Carrie Woodson Hill, and they were farmers. Her father was a deacon at Mount Moriah Baptist Church, but Libby joined her mother's church, First Rock Baptist. Her husband was also a deacon at First Rock, working on the lining bar gang for the Northern and Western Railroad for years. Later, he returned to Prospect to cut pulpwood, where Libby Jordan commented that he earned just as much money as he did when he worked on the railroad until he retired. Jordan was a housewife until the youngest of her 3 children graduated from high school. After the public schools reopened, she became an instructional assistant in the Prince Edward County schools. Children from the Peaks Baptist Church and First Rock Baptist Church communities attended the St. James School, where Jordan and Davenport worked. Jordan used her personal vehicle to transport Davenport and other students to and from school every day that it operated. Jordan remembered that the school day usually began at 9 and ended between 1 and 2. She says, "I taught my students how to read. See, we didn't use any official textbooks like the ones they use in schools. We had to make things up, do the best you could." Davenport and Jordan did have a chalkboard and chalk, which may have been donated by the PECCA and American Friends. In 1959, when Jordan was well into her 40s, Davenport recruited her to become a teacher in the St. James Grassroots School. Since Davenport practically had known Jordan all of her life, she was sure that she would be an excellent teacher. Mrs. Davenport took over Elizabeth Watkins' responsibilities as supervisor or older high school teacher, and she asked her former student, Libby Jordan, to be her assistant. Jordan taught the elementary school age students. Neither Davenport nor Jordan complied with the stated objectives of the Prince Edward County Christian Association, which was to operate these centers as study playgroups. These women employed teaching strategies similar to the ones they would have used in a regular classroom. Dorothy Holcomb, a former student in the St. James Grassroots School, recalled, and I quote, "I have to say, St. James was not a recreational center. Mrs. Davenport was very serious about what we did, and I remember having old beat up books and using them and reading and doing math and doing English. I even remember conjugating verbs. We did work. Gloria Lockett Bowler, born in 1948 and in the 4th grade when public schools closed, had similar memories of the St. James School. When public schools reopened, Bowler was placed in her right grade. She credited her attendance at St. James for her ability to keep up. She said, "When schools reopened, I was placed in Algebra 2 and had never had Algebra 1. I was able to keep up and understand. The math I had at St. James helped." The math I had at St. James, helped. Other examples of Black Prince Edward County women who organized academically focused grassroots schools were Alberta Sims and Cula Behrman. Alberta Sims, former Robert Russell Moton High School teacher, and Cula Behrman, mother of 7 children and wife of a minister, operated a school in the back of Odell Womack's grocery store. Like Hudson's and the St. James School, the school operated by Sims and Behrman was designed to teach, not only to boost morale. Cula Dungy Behrman was born April 11, 1923 in Prospect. Her parents, McKinley Dungy and Hetty Johns Dungy, owned approximately 75 acres of land on the outskirts of the Five Forks community, about 2 miles from Pamplin City. Land ownership provided Blacks with a degree of autonomy and power that sharecroppers or tenant farmers did not have. Behrman grew up in a home with 10 brothers and sisters and 5 stepbrothers and sisters who all attended Sulphur Spring Baptist Church. In 1943, and on graduation, she moved to Washington, D.C., where she lived with her uncle and attended Howard University while working as a waitress in the dining hall of the Department of the Interior. She married Everett Behrman, a World War II veteran, and in May 1946, they returned to Prospect. She attended Virginia Seminary for an additional year. Behrman was academically prepared to teach students locked out of school. Sims was a resident and native of Prospect and was born February 13, 1931. Upon graduation from Robert Moton High, Sims earned her undergraduate degree from Bluefield State College in West Virginia. She returned to Prince Edward and taught in the public school system for 24 years. She died very unexpectedly on March 14, 1990 in Farmville. Behrman, Sims, and Hudson attended Sulphur Spring Baptist Church in Prospect. Though Behrman had familial connections to Calvary Baptist, about 5 miles from Sulphur Spring, the 3 women had a relationship long before they decided to band together to help their community's children. Much like Davenport and Jordan, Behrman, Sims, and Hudson had worked in the same Baptist church and were members of the NAACP. When asked if the centers held classes or just recreational activities, Ms. Behrman responded, "We had classes. Now, if you thought there was going to be anything within the classes that you could do to capture their attention, you would have to do that. Now, there was no formal person over you or head to tell you what to do. You were just there to help the students. Of course, we had recess and things. We just carried along on the same scale as school." Behrman, like other grassroots school teachers, was determined to offer community youth the same types of classes that public schools provided. Education has historically been a civil rights issue, and the war for racial equity in education wages on today. The school-to-prison pipeline continues to contribute dramatically to mass incarceration. The American Civil Liberties Union defines school-to-prison pipeline as the policies and practices that push our nation's school children, especially our most at-risk children, out of the classroom and to the juvenile criminal justice system. This pipeline reflects the prioritization of incarceration over education. The pipeline begins with inadequate resources, the zero tolerance policies, policing school hallways, alternative schools, then the juvenile justice system. Behaviors that once led to a trip to the principal's office and detention, such as school uniform violations, profanity, and talking back, now often lead to suspension, expulsion, and/or arrest. Today, largely as a result of zero tolerance policies that mandate harsh punishments for even minor misbehavior in school, 3.3 million children are suspended or expelled from school each year, approximately double the rate of the 1970s. Further, harsh school discipline policies disproportionately impact students of color, students with disabilities, and students who identify as members of the LGBTQIA community. Data from Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights shows that Black students are suspended and expelled at rates 3 times greater than their white peers. According to data from the US Department of Education, cited in a report from the American Policy Forum, Black girls were suspended 6 times more than white girls, while Black boys were suspended 3 times as often as white boys. This reality is what prompted educators and scholars like Dr. Bettina Love to employ what she calls abolitionist teaching methods. According to Dr. Love, abolitionist teaching tries to restore humanity for kids in schools. Abolitionist teachers are willing to put their reputation, home, and lives on the line for other people's children. Abolitionist teaching applies methods like protests, calling out other teachers who are racist, homophobic, or Islamophobic. It is about Black joy and always putting love at the center of what we're doing. The Prince Edward County story provides historical insight that helps to inform our contemporary understanding of Brown, grassroots activism, and the power of racism as related to educational opportunity in Virginia. It is important to remember the risks and rewards of Prince Edward County Black activists and the nearly 2,000 students who lost years of education because Virginia segregationists closed public schools rather than desegregate them. Grassroots teachers in Prince Edward County were abolitionist teachers. They were fighting white supremacy by daring to recognize the humanity in Black children the white power structure declared unworthy of education, a human right. At the center of their motivation to teach community children with no pay, simply an obligation to leave the world better than what they found it, was love. Black women in Prince Edward County, Virginia, abolitionists and activists. Thank you. I don't know if I'm supposed to take comments or questions. I'm happy to do so at this time.
Yeah, I guess we can give a few second delay if there's any quick any questions there. I'm not seeing any pop up, but I can ask those if they do come up. I do appreciate, and on behalf of the museum, and I'm sure certainly our viewers watching, you presenting and all the insight that you have given to Prince Edward County and specifically Black women in Prince Edward County. I mean, I thought I knew more than I did. Certainly I've learned a lot myself, so I can only imagine what our casual viewers have also kind of gleaned from your presentation. In particular, part that stood out to me was the abolitionist teaching component. I mean, certainly that's something I'm going to do some more research on and look a lot more into. And as an educator, fascinating to me as a concept and a construct. And
that's Dr. Bettina Love's term. She wrote a book recently where she's talking about we want to do more than just survive. You know, we always think about, you know, if we can just make it another day, you know, and lots of times, especially as prevalent as racial trauma is, right? Most of the time, Blacks, even from the elementary school all the way up through, you know, almost retirement age, have been taught to kind of suck it up. This is what you deal with. This is the way it is. And so you just endure it just so that you can live another day, right? If we apply this, and I won't, don't worry, to even the mass incarceration or the police murders of Blacks, you know, that the talk that many Black parents are giving their children has to do with basically keeping your mouth shut, saying just the right thing so that you can live another day. And Dr. Tina Love and her cadre of other scholars and educators has said, you know what? We want to do more than just survive. We want to thrive. And what she has realized, as have so many other scholars, especially contemporarily, is that in order to do that, we have to take on this new form of abolitionist teaching. We have to really snuff out those old dogmas that support the structure that disallow racial equity. And so I'm a fan of that as well. So, and what in my research of Prince Edward County, what I found even before the name is that you have these Black women who are actually abolitionist teachers. They have embodied the philosophy and the methodology that Dr. Love is talking about in her work.
Yeah, I very much value giving academic terminology to things and principles that we might already know of and about. But like, okay, now I can know what to call it, right, and where to take it. I did see one question in the chat that was basically, when's your manuscript going to be published? Do you reckon? What's a good timeline for that?
Oh gosh. Soon, very, very, very soon. Right now, I think I have one more full chapter to write, and that's the introduction. I think what's taken me so long is that Prince Edward is my home. You know, I love the county. I grew up there. Everybody there, some who I'm sure are in this conversation right now, is because of what you've done and your experiences and what you've endured that have allowed me to get to where I am today. And I want to tell the story right. And so being from the community is both a blessing and a curse, right? It gives you insight, but then I think I'm holding myself back, trying to make sure I say just the right thing and include everyone that I'm supposed to. So it's taking a while. That on top of family and responsibilities for work, not making excuses, it's just what is. But so if I had to give a timeline, I'd say within the next year.
In the next year, you heard it here first. Well, yeah, we'll look forward to that coming out. I definitely think, at minimum, everybody in the chat here will be interested, but certainly we will look forward to that release and having some future programming potentially centered around that as well, hopefully.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, well, that puts an end to our Moton Mondays for today. Thanks to all for attending. And then see you for the next one. Dr. Tillerson-Brown, thank you again so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.